Title: I fell in love with the most dangerous mafia. Luca's life had always been routine and predictable. Mornings were spent serving coffee at the cafe he worked at. Afternoons passed in quiet solitude, and evenings were spent watching the occasional TV series in his small, cramped apartment. He wasn't anyone special. He was a quiet, introverted young man who barely stood out. He liked it that way. He preferred to remain invisible in the hustle of the big city. But one night, everything changed. Luca had just finished a late shift at the cafe. The night was cold, and the streets were empty as he walked home, his breath visible in the chilly air. The city lights shimmered around him, casting long shadows. Luca always took the same route back to his apartment, a few blocks through dimly lit streets, past some closed shops, and up the stairs to his small sanctuary. It was a routine he had followed for months without incident. But as he rounded the corner that night, something felt off. The street was too quiet, and there was a chill in the air that wasn't just from the cold. Luca quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. But before he could make it to the next block, a black car screeched to a halt beside him. Before Luca could react, two men in dark suits got out. Everything happened in a blur. He felt strong hands grab him, pulling him backward. His muffled scream was cut off by a cloth pressed against his mouth, and the world around him started to spin. Darkness closed in. And the last thing he heard before losing consciousness was the low rumble of the car's engine as it sped away. When Luca came conscious, the first thing he noticed was the cold, hard surface beneath him. His hands were tied behind his back, and his eyes were covered with a blindfold. Panic surged through him as he struggled to sit up, his heart racing in his chest. Where was he? What was happening? Why had someone taken him? He tried to wriggle free from the ropes that bound him, but they were too tight. His breath came in short gasps, and just as he was about to scream for help, he heard the sound of a door opening. Footsteps approached him, slow, deliberate, and heavy. The blindfold was ripped away, and Luca squinted as his eyes adjusted to the dimly lit room. The room was luxurious, expensive leather furniture, dark wooden paneling, and large windows that overlooked the city skyline. But it wasn't the room that made Luca's stomach twist with fear. It was the man standing before him. He was tall, his presence commanding and overwhelming. He wore a sharp, tailored suit that clung to his muscular frame, and his dark hair was slicked back. His sharp jawline and chiseled features looked as though they had been carved from stone, and his eyes cold, calculating, and intense, pinned Luca in place. He was tall, his presence commanding and overwhelming. He wore a sharp, tailored suit that clung to his muscular frame, and his dark hair was slicked back. His sharp jawline and chiseled features looked as though they had been carved from stone, and his eyes cold, calculating, and intense, pinned Luca in place. The man stared at Luca for a long moment, as though assessing him, before he finally spoke. Luca, isn't it? The man's voice was deep, with a slight accent, dripping with authority. Luca's throat tightened as he forced himself to nod. What do you want with me? His voice was small, trembling with fear. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked around Luca, his gaze never leaving him. The silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, the man stopped in front of Luca, crouching down so that their faces were level. His eyes bored into Luca's, and for a moment, it felt as though this man could see right through him. My name is Matteo De Luca, the man said, his voice cold. And you, Luca, are now in my possession. Luca's heart skipped a beat. De Luca. He had heard the name before. Everyone in the city had. Matteo De Luca was the head of one of the most powerful mafia families in the region. Dangerous, untouchable, feared by everyone. Luca's pulse quickened, fear settling deep in his chest. You've got the wrong person, Luca stammered, his voice shaking. I don't know you. I haven't done anything. Please, let me go. Matteo's expression didn't change. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from Luca's face, his fingers cold against Luca's skin. You haven't done anything, Matteo agreed, his tone almost soft. But that doesn't matter. You see, Luca, I've been watching you. I know everything about you. And when I want something, I take it, and right now, I want you." Luca's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing to comprehend what was happening. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? Why would a man like Matteo De Luca want him, a nobody, a barista from a small cafe? You can't just kidnap someone because you want them, Luca protested, panic rising in his voice. Matteo smiled then, a slow, predatory smile that sent chills down Luca's spine. "I can, and I did." Luca's new life began that very night. He was no longer free. Matteo De Luca had claimed him, and there was no escaping the possessive, dangerous man who now controlled his every move. From the moment Luca had been taken, he was confined to Matteo's sprawling penthouse, a palace of luxury and wealth that only reminded him of how far removed from his old life he was. The first few days were a blur of fear and confusion. Matteo's men were always around, watching him like hawks, ensuring that Luca didn't try to escape. His every move was monitored, and even when he was alone in the vast penthouse, the presence of Matteo lingered in every corner. And Matteo? He was always near. His possessiveness was palpable. Every time Matteo entered the room, Luca felt the weight of his gaze on him, intense, controlling, hungry. Luca had never met anyone like him before. Matteo was a force of nature, a man who could command the world with a single word. And now, he had his sights set on Luca. It was during one of those long, oppressive days that Luca realized just how deep Matteo's obsession went. Matteo had taken to sitting in the same room as Luca whenever he wasn't attending to his Mafia business. He would sit quietly, watching Luca with those dark, piercing eyes, as though Luca were the most valuable thing in the world. One evening, Luca couldn't take it anymore. The constant staring, the oppressive atmosphere, it was suffocating. Luca stood up from the couch where he had been curled up, trying to read a book in silence, and turned to Matteo, who sat in a leather chair across the room. "Why me?" Luca asked, his voice trembling with frustration and fear. "Why are you doing this? I'm nobody. You can have anything you want. Why would you take someone like me?" Matteo's eyes flicked up to meet Luca's, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he stood from his chair, crossing the room with the grace and menace of a predator stalking its prey. Luca backed up instinctively, his heart racing as Matteo approached him. "You think I don't know what I want?" Matteo asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I've had everything. Wealth, power, control. But when I saw you, Luca, something in me shifted. You don't belong to the world out there. You belong to me." Luca's pulse quickened as Matteo closed the distance between them. He felt trapped, his back pressing against the wall as Matteo leaned in, his face inches from Luca's. "You don't understand it yet," Matteo murmured, his voice smooth and commanding. "But you will. No one can protect you like I can. No one will ever want you the way I do." Luca swallowed hard, his mind racing. He didn't understand how this had happened, how his life had spiraled out of control so quickly. But as Matteo's gaze bore into him, Luca realized something terrifying. A part of him was starting to believe Matteo's words. Matteo's hand reached out, brushing against Luca's cheek with a gentleness that didn't match the dangerous aura he radiated. Luca shivered under the touch, his body betraying him with a warmth he didn't want to acknowledge. "You'll see, Luca," Matteo whispered, his lips brushing against Luca's ear. "You're mine now, and no one will ever take you away from me." Weeks passed, and though Luca still felt like a caged bird, the initial terror had started to dissipate. His fear of Matteo had evolved into something more complicated, something he didn't want to acknowledge. He hated himself for it, but there was no denying the pull Matteo had over him. At first, Luca had resisted. He spent most of his time pacing his room or glaring at Matteo whenever they were forced to interact. But Matteo was always calm, always composed, his possessive nature tempered by a strange sort of patience. He never raised his voice, never hurt Luca physically, and in his twisted way, Matteo ensured that Luca was well taken care of. Anything Luca wanted or needed was at his disposal, as long as he stayed under Matteo's watchful eye. And it was that constant attention that started to wear Luca down. Matteo was always there, observing, protecting. It was suffocating, but it was also intoxicating. Luca couldn't ignore the chemistry that simmered between them. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when Matteo's touch lingered just a little too long, or when their eyes met across the room, and something unspoken passed between them. It was a tension that Luca couldn't escape, no matter how much he tried to suppress it. One night, after yet another silent dinner shared in Matteo's penthouse, Luca found himself unable to sleep. His mind raced, replaying the strange intimacy that had grown between them. Matteo hadn't made any overt moves, but there was an undeniable magnetism in the way he looked at Luca, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Luca lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to push the thoughts away. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. Matteo was his captor, not his lover. But as the hours ticked by, Luca's resolve weakened, and he found himself slipping out of bed, drawn to Matteo's presence in the next room. The penthouse was quiet, save for the sound of Luca's soft footsteps as he padded across the floor. He hesitated outside Matteo's door, his hand trembling as it hovered over the doorknob. "What am I doing?" Luca thought to himself, his heart pounding in his chest. Before he could talk himself out of it, Luca pushed the door open, stepping inside. Matteo was seated in a leather chair by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his sharp gaze turning toward Luca the moment he entered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Matteo's expression was unreadable, but Luca could feel the intensity of his gaze, the way it seemed to strip away all of Luca's defenses. "You couldn't sleep," Matteo said, his voice deep and smooth, breaking the silence. Luca swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he simply shook his head, his eyes flicking to the floor. Matteo set his glass down on the table beside him and stood, slowly crossing the room until he was standing just inches from Luca. He reached out, his fingers tilting Luca's chin up so that their eyes met. There was something dangerous in Matteo's gaze, something dark and possessive. But there was also a softness there, something that Luca hadn't noticed before. "Tell me why you're here, Luca," Matteo whispered, his voice sending shivers down Luca's spine. Luca couldn't find the words. His mind was a jumbled mess of confusion and desire, and all he could do was stare up at Matteo, his breath hitching in his throat. Matteo's hand slid from Luca's chin to the back of his neck, his fingers tangling in Luca's hair. He pulled Luca closer, their bodies almost touching, and Luca's heart raced as he felt the heat radiating off Matteo's body. "I've been patient," Matteo murmured, his lips dangerously close to Luca's. "But there's only so much restraint I have left." Luca's pulse quickened, his body betraying him as he leaned into Matteo's touch. He didn't know what he was doing. Everything in his mind screamed that this was wrong, that he should push Matteo away and run. But his body didn't listen. Instead, he found himself closing the distance between them, his breath shallow as he whispered, "I don't know what I want." Matteo's eyes darkened, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "I do," he said, his voice dripping with control. Before Luca could say another word, Matteo's lips crashed against his, stealing the breath from his lungs. The kiss was fierce, demanding, and Luca melted into it, his mind going blank as he gave into the overwhelming sensation. Matteo's hands gripped Luca's waist, pulling him closer, and Luca felt like he was drowning in the intensity of it all. Every touch, every movement was possessive, claiming Luca as if he were Matteo's to own. And in that moment, Luca didn't care. He didn't care about the past or how wrong this was. All that mattered was the heat between them, the way Matteo's lips moved against his with such hunger and need. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. Luca's mind spun with confusion, but his body ached for more. "I won't let you go," Matteo whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You're mine, Luca, whether you realize it or not." Luca's heart pounded in his chest. But for the first time since his abduction, he didn't feel fear. Instead, there was something else, a dangerous, thrilling excitement that he couldn't ignore. In the days that followed, Luca's relationship with Matteo grew more complex. There were moments of undeniable passion, times when Matteo's possessiveness and Luca's simmering desire collided in ways that left them both breathless. But there were also moments of tension, where the reality of their situation crashed down on Luca, reminding him that he was still a prisoner in Matteo's world. Luca tried to resist the pull Matteo had over him, but every time he attempted to distance himself, Matteo would reel him back in, using his charm and sheer force of will to keep Luca close. And Luca, despite himself, couldn't resist. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Luca found himself pacing the penthouse, his mind racing with frustration. He hated how easily Matteo could control him, how effortlessly Matteo could make him feel things he didn't want to feel. But as much as Luca wanted to hate Matteo, he couldn't deny the way his heart raced whenever Matteo was near, or the way his body reacted to Matteo's touch. It was a constant push and pull, a battle between his mind and his heart. That night, Matteo found Luca standing by the window, staring out at the city below. Without a word, Matteo approached him, his presence a comforting yet dangerous weight behind Luca. "I know you're struggling," Matteo said quietly, his voice unusually gentle. "But you can't fight this forever." Luca didn't turn to face him. "You don't get it. I didn't choose this. You forced me into this." Matteo stepped closer, his hand resting on Luca's shoulder. "You didn't choose me," he agreed, his voice low. "But you're still here, and you haven't tried to leave." Luca's breath hitched, and he hated how true Matteo's words were. He hadn't tried to escape, not really, and part of him didn't want to. Matteo's hand slid down Luca's arm, his touch sending a familiar shiver through Luca's body. "You belong to me, Luca," Matteo whispered, his breath hot against Luca's neck. "And deep down, you know it." Luca closed his eyes, his body betraying him once again as he leaned back into Matteo's embrace. He wanted to fight it, to resist the magnetic pull that Matteo had over him. But the truth was, he was tired of fighting. He was tired of pretending that he didn't feel something for the dangerous man who had kidnapped him. Tired of denying the connection that had grown between them. "I hate you," Luca whispered, his voice trembling with both anger and desire. Matteo chuckled softly, his lips brushing against Luca's ear. "No, you don't. You want me, Luca, just like I want you." Luca shivered at Matteo's words, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't respond, he couldn't, because deep down, he knew Matteo was right. As the weeks turned into months, Luca's feelings for Matteo became more complicated. He still resented the way Matteo had taken him, the way his life had been ripped from his control. But at the same time, Luca couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them. It was twisted and wrong, but it was real. Matteo's possessiveness hadn't lessened, in fact, it had only grown stronger. He made it clear to Luca every day that he belonged to him, and Luca, despite his initial resistance, found himself craving Matteo's attention more and more. One night, after a particularly intense love-making between them, Luca lay in bed beside Matteo, his body still tingling from their earlier encounter. He stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of how far he had fallen. "I never wanted this," Luca whispered, his voice barely audible in the darkness. Matteo, who was lying beside him, turned his head to look at Luca, his expression unreadable. "But you have it?" he replied, his voice firm. Luca turned to face him, his eyes searching Matteo's. "What happens now? Am I just supposed to stay here forever, a prisoner in your world?" Matteo's gaze softened, just for a moment. "You're not a prisoner, Luca, not anymore. You're here because you want to be. You could leave if you wanted to, but you won't." Luca's breath caught in his throat at Matteo's words. Could he really leave? Was there truly a choice? Matteo leaned in, his hand gently caressing Luca's cheek. "I won't let you go," he whispered, his voice filled with both tenderness and possessiveness. But I'll never hurt you. I'll protect you, keep you safe. All you have to do is stay by my side. Luca's heart ached with the weight of his emotions. He didn't know what to do, didn't know if he could trust Matteo or himself. But as Matteo's lips brushed against his once more, Luca realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to have all the answers. Maybe, in this dangerous, twisted world, all he needed was Matteo. Luca swallowed hard, his breath catching as Matteo's thumb gently stroked his cheek. I can't. His words faltered as Matteo's hand slid down to the back of his neck, pulling him closer. You're mine, Luca, Matteo whispered, his lips so close to Luca's that he could feel the warmth of his breath. No one will ever touch you the way I do. No one will ever make you feel the way I can. Possessive and demanding. Luca's body tensed, but as Matteo's hand slid down his back, pulling him closer, Luca felt himself giving in. He hated it, but at the same time, the fire in Matteo's kiss ignited something deep inside him, something he couldn't deny any longer. Matteo broke the kiss just long enough to murmur against Luca's lips. I told you, didn't I? You're mine now, completely. Luca's heart raced as Matteo's lips moved down to his neck, his breath hot against Luca's skin. A shiver ran through Luca's body, and despite everything, he found himself leaning into Matteo's touch, his resolve crumbling under the weight of the desire that coursed through him. Say it, Matteo whispered, his voice low and commanding. Tell me you're mine. Luca's breath hitched, and for a moment he tried to resist. But as Matteo's hand gripped his waist, pulling him even closer, Luca's willpower dissolved. I'm yours, Luca whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm yours. Matteo's lips curled into a satisfied smile against Luca's skin, and he pressed a possessive kiss to the base of Luca's throat. You'll never regret it. Good boy, he murmured. Before Luca could protest, Matteo's lips were on his firm. Matteo flipped Luca down on the bed, pinning him on the bed. He grabbed Luca's butt, and they ended up in another passionate lovemaking. Few months have passed since then, and now, Luca's heart pounded as he stood on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. The cool night breeze tugged at his hair, but his thoughts were miles away, consumed by everything that had happened. He was surprised he stayed here, with a man who had kidnapped him, turned his world upside down, and yet somehow made him feel more alive than he ever had before. Footsteps approached from behind, and Luca didn't have to turn around to know it was Matteo. The man's presence was undeniable, always filling the room with a magnetic force Luca couldn't escape. Matteo stepped closer, his arms circling Luca's waist as he pulled him against his chest. Luca felt the warmth of Matteo's body, the steady rise and fall of his breath, and despite everything, it was comforting. Luca closed his eyes, a small smile tugging at his lips. Turning in Matteo's arms, Luca met his gaze, those dark, intense eyes that had once filled him with fear now made his heart race for different reasons. He didn't know how it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had fallen for this dangerous man who had taken him. I'm not going anywhere, Luca said quietly, his voice laced with resignation, but also something more acceptance. Matteo's lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile. Good, he murmured, leaning in to press a soft kiss to Luca's forehead. Because I'd never let you go. Luca let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. You're impossible, you know that, and yet, here you are. Matteo replied, pulling Luca closer, his hand resting on the small of Luca's back. Luca couldn't argue with that. He had fought it, resisted for so long. But now, standing in Matteo's arms with the city sprawling out beneath them, he realized that there was no escaping this. Matteo had captured more than just his freedom, he had captured his heart. I love you, Luca whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Matteo froze for a moment, and when Luca looked up at him, he saw something raw, something vulnerable in Matteo's eyes. For all his strength and power, Matteo had never expected to hear those words from Luca. Slowly, Matteo's hand came up to cradle Luca's face, his thumb gently brushing across Luca's cheek. I love you two, Matteo whispered back, his voice rough with emotion. More than anything, Luca smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest as Matteo's lips captured his in a tender kiss. In that moment, nothing else mattered. As they pulled apart, Matteo rested his forehead against Luca's, their breaths mingling in the cool air. You're mine, Luca, Matteo said, his voice soft but firm. Forever. Luca's heart fluttered at the possessiveness in Matteo's tone. But instead of fear, all he felt was love. Forever, Luca whispered, sealing the promise with another kiss. And in that cliché moment, they both knew that no matter what happened, they would face the future together, always. The end.